Congressman, how did you first become interested in the topics you discussed in the panel this afternoon?
Well, I've always been interested in the founding documents. My work in Congress, you always try to go back to the origins of American thought, the intent of the founders when you're interpreting what direction the Congress should take in a particular area. And so for me, the Constitution is one of those founding documents. The Federalist Papers, which govern the debate of adopting the Constitution, but also the origins of America's Declaration are critical. What were the founders thinking about? How did they negotiate that document? How did that document and the concepts in it affect the Constitution? So it's always been fascinating to me.
What made you want to be, or how did you end up as a representative?
Well, I've always believed in public service. I don't think you have to run for elective office to be a public servant. You can be on your school board, or you can volunteer at your church or your scout troop. It doesn't require elected office. But I'd had the pleasure in my career to work for the Senate as a staffer when I was in my 20s, and then President Bush asked me to serve on his White House staff when I was in my late 20s and early 30s. So I've seen what good public service looks like, and when I had been in my banking career for a long time, I decided I wanted to do one more thing in public service, and I didn't believe that, having been out of the mix for a long time, that going into an appointed office was the right way to go. So I explored running for the state legislature, which I announced that I was going to do. And then my congressman called me one day in the middle of that campaign and said, I'm going to resign. So I jumped into the race for Congress, and I've now been in Congress just over a decade.
What do you think the most important topic or idea that you discussed on the panel is, and what would you want the American people to walk away with?
I think when I was reviewing the edits to the Declaration, some 86 changes to this revered document that we credit Thomas Jefferson with writing, and he did write it. He was the principal author. It shows me how literate all the delegates to the Continental Congress were, how well read they were, how balanced they were in making those changes that makes this a stronger, better, more clear document of American independence. And it's inspirational. And I think walking away from that is this document was drafted initially by Jefferson, but edited by all the members of the Continental Congress, and yet you have this elegance. And so I think it speaks to the character and education and capability of all those early founding fathers.
What do you think is most misunderstood about our Constitution?
Well, I think in the modern society, in the 20th and 21st century, we have put far too much authority in the Article II branch of government, the executive branch. 50% of the words of the Constitution, so half the document, delineate the powers of Congress, the legislative branch. But over the years, particularly since the 1930s, you've seen the legislative branch be diluted by the large bureaucratic administrative state under the control of the executive branch. And so I think people believe Congress has more authority and more power than they are using. And so I'd say that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see. And I think members of Congress, both political parties, should reassert that Article I power and make sure that our power of oversight, our power of the purse, our power of delineating what we want the executive to do is clear. And we have a lot of work to do on that front.
What, or maybe more aptly, who do you think catalyzed that change towards a centralization of power in the executive branch?
Well, it certainly was a trend from the administration of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There's no doubt that's where that first 50 years of the 20th century, where you saw it grow massively. In fact, Calvin Coolidge was a real respite in that. He rejected that philosophy as president, and America was more prosperous during the years, I think, because he did reject that philosophy, and he wanted a lower tax, lower intrusive federal government, closer to the core principles of the Constitution. And we've never gone back. We really haven't. The Great Society programs of the 1960s only compounded that. And the best illustration for our citizens is in the 1960s, maybe 20% of our whole federal budget was considered mandatory spending. Now it's essentially 80%, almost 80%. 75% of the federal budget is mandatory spending, which means Congress can't really change it. It's tied to a particular element. You know, if you're over 65, you're receiving benefits, or if you're disabled, you're receiving benefits. And so we've never modified those programs, and we've just allowed government to get to the size and scope that it is today.
Wow. Were there any sort of topics or ideas that you didn't get the chance to mention during the panel that you'd like to expand upon now?
Well, there was a good discussion, I thought, about that the panel had on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I've always thought that was one of the most elegant phrases in the Declaration of Independence. But if you go back at earlier drafts, John Adams used the concept of the pursuit of happiness, but people who read John Locke and essentially copied his work as it was put in place in the various colonial assemblies, you saw acquisition of property as a key component. But I think it was elegant that Jefferson settled on pursuit of happiness, because I think that implies the use of property. It implies the future that you have to carry out your life with your family, with a profession, and it's really become synonymous with the American dream and American exceptionalism.
Are Calvin Coolidge's views on the American Constitution still relevant today? And if so, what should Americans remember from Coolidge?
Well, Coolidge, in his thinking about a strict interpretation of the Constitution and also the founding documents like the Declaration, believed that they were just as viable, just as lively, just as relevant today as they were when they were written. So he felt that very passionately in 1924, that they were just as relevant as when they were ratified by the states back in the 1780s. Obviously, that's not the view of a lot of people. But what could be more clear than rights from our Creator, the ability to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a measurement, that there are enumerated powers in the Constitution, Coolidge outlined, and then anything that wasn't enumerated was left to either the states or to the people. And he just didn't, you could not get Calvin Coolidge to create a new federal government solution. He just didn't think that was the role of the federal government.